don't know if you're going to see the count now. Welcome to another episode of MainUNStream. Today I'm joined again on the mic by a good friend, Simon Michaux, Associate Professor, Aussie, living in Finland and advising large corporates and governments in a variety of areas, specifically with regard to resources, money, finance, and just about everything which really relates to how we as a species are going to survive on this planet. And I realize that sounds a little bit dramatic, but quite frankly, if we were to narrow it down to the bare bones, that's what it sort of comes down to. Simon, welcome. How you going, mate?
G'day, mate. How you doing? I'm part of a Geological Survey of Finland, and every now and then different parts of the Ministry of Finland, but also the European Union, come and talk to us and they ask for our data. There you go.
Yeah.
That's it. So,
there you go. Because I sounded pretty doomsday then, didn't I? Far out. But quite frankly, today we're going to have a welcome back. By the way, thank you very much for anyone who missed the last episode with Simon, where we went and talked quite in detail about the energy resources and reserves of the planet. If you haven't seen that, I encourage you to go to the playlist on YouTube and watch it. If you're listening to this on the podcast, both for this episode and for the previous one, I would highly recommend you go to the YouTube channel, because then you'll be able to see all the slides that Simon's referring to, because he's prepared some excellent data to back up what he's going to be telling us about. And today we're going to be looking at the fragility of the financial system. A lot of people just don't want to know about it. They don't believe that we have any problems. Life is just going to go on. People will keep earning money. People will keep printing money, providing they're called a government and not a counterfeiter. And everything's going to be everything's gonna be honky dory. But as I tell people, no one can make money. Only a government can. Only a central bank can make money. But Simon, you've got some pretty revealing data to share with us today, and I know we've got a lot to get through. So where would you like to start? I'll just hand over to you. You tell me, and we'll go.
All right. Okay, share.
Yeah, I'll just add that to the.
I can send you the slide stack too if you need. Now I'm not an economist. What has happened here is I was required to dig into this, to understand something I'd gotten hold of in a previous study. I was trying to understand the oil industry, and in particular what ends up what we now call the petrodollar, which we'll go into later in the presentation. I also found that derivatives, the credit default swaps, were awash throughout the global economy, and the most commonly traded commodity within that set was oil. Right, so that's how I got to going down this particular rabbit hole. And so,
and that's really your bailiwick. Oil and resources is something that you know a lot about. So I imagine that just came up as a big red light for you.
It turns out if you look into the energy sector, you must look into the financial sector. And that we'll get into that why that is later, but they are joined at the hip, right? When we get to the history of the financial system and we talk about the decoupling of the gold standard of the US dollar, and a few years later, the Petrodollar Agreement forced the rest of the world to engage in the US fiat currency system, and everything had to be paid for in US dollars. Right, and so it became the handover point. And I've also got the structure of the financial system as well to show the role of big banks and hedge funds. Right, how big they are and where they are. So anyway, we'll get to all that. It's I must admit, when I went down this particular rabbit hole, I found a lot of people saying, "Oh, just leave this to the economists." But I found that mainstream economics has really let us down. They've really dropped the ball on this one. So anyone listening who is encouraged to look at these things, take the time to educate yourself. You can be wrong, but you can also correct yourself. Mainstream pundits for this sort of thing, I found to be most disappointing. And we are heading towards a very difficult situation. So, all right, let's get into it. I'll just roll along and you just ask me questions whenever, yeah?
Yep, fair enough.
Yep. Okay, this is where we were at the end of the last podcast. right, where this is all the metals that are tracked by the World Bank to look at the health of the global economy. And what I did was actually overlaid those prices for aluminium, iron ore, copper, lead, etc., etc., etc. And I pinned it to the month December 2001 and the number 100. So that is actually they're pinned to this point here. I've actually done the same point for back to 1970, and we can go through that later to work out what happened back here. But you had a relative period of stability, and everything blew out in 2005. And so a case can be made that this is a blowout, is a chain reaction that started in the oil industry. And the global financial crisis of 2008 was the weakest link broke, which happened to be in the US housing system, after unprecedented pressure put onto the system. And that was for a couple of years before it actually broke. So, and then after that GFC crisis, we have the same volatility, but it's now held together with quantitative easing. So since 2008, it's been held together with chewing gum and positive thinking. So when we're talking,
we're going to get into quantitative easing later on, right?
We are.
Yeah,
I've got some. In fact, I've got some details of what it is and how it got here, and it will make your hair curl, you in particular.
I can feel the roots tingling already.
I must admit, when I first looked down this rabbit hole, my first instinct is surely I've got this wrong. Surely that's not the way it's done. But here it is. It's irrational. Anyway, so the point of this slide is the change that we're looking at started 15 years in the past. It's not something that might happen like next year or in sometime in the future. But today's presentation is to show that this situation was created decades ago, as in choices made a century ago even brought us here. So anyway, we're told that everything's fine. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Average back to 1915, right? And so well, life's good, never better, right? So there's the GFC there. And so the GFC was the largest economic correction in 2008 since the 1929 Great Depression. All right. So I've taken that data, and here's the same data, but now it's actually sort of back to 2000, so we can sort of see a bit of resolution. That's the GFC, Global Financial Crisis. And it was fixed by quantitative easing. They just started pumping money into the system, and public confidence came back. The whole system's held up by public confidence. And QE1 finished there, 2 started there, and 2 finished there, 3 started there, and 3 finished there. That's the stuff they've admitted to. Now, to kick this off, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, was called Person of the Year for saving the world, which is smoke and mirrors, yeah. So here is a summary of quantitative easing that's been sort of done globally. It's a mistake to think, for example, only the United States does this, because it turns out all major economies are doing this, and in fact, the worst offender is probably China. So these are the dates, and you've got the numbers over here.
And Australia's thinking about doing it at the moment.
They have decided to do it, I believe.
Yeah,
but they're late to the game. It was now to the point where it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. These are the groups that have gone through. The European Union one, they've just decided to step in and do these bond purchases, and their reasons for it, that they state are a little murky. Like at least the US was able to say, well, we've got the GFC, we've got to fix it, blah blah blah. But most of this stuff happened when we didn't have an obvious problem, which, yeah. So this is where we were at last time. Now, what's happened here is I've taken all the large actions within the United States. The reason I use the United States as the primary example, we'll get to in a minute, but they have the bulk of the system, and they're the world reserve currency. But we'll be looking at China and Europe and the UK and all the rest of them as well. Right, so what we've got down in the left-hand column here is all the large purchases of finance at the time. Louisiana, the state of Louisiana purchase back in 1803 was 15 million, but in 2018 dollars it was 212 million. Then we got the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, Race to the Moon, SNL crisis. These are all the big ticket items, right?
Yep.
Right. Well, that blue section there fits into the blue section in the bottom graph, and the bottom graph is military actions in red. This is the cost of war. The Gulf War, Korean War, Vietnam War. What is not on this chart is World War II, which is actually quite large compared to all of these. And I couldn't fit it on. But when we get to quantitative easing, that's to put this in scale. The quantitative easing actions that have actually been put on far dwarf anything sensible. That's the blue section there. This is the stuff worth spending money on, all the civilian stuff. All the military stuff, well, war's a racket, and did we really need to do it? So now this is the stuff that they've admitted to up till October 2014. Since then, with the COVID crisis and the year before the COVID crisis, lots and lots and lots of money has been put in since then. In the last few weeks of 2019, they put in 6 trillion, and for a short period of time, the banking sector was being supported by 1 trillion a day. Now, some of the estimates try and yeah.
So, end of last year, they put in triple.
Yeah, that's right.
One, right, and then and it's been like 1 trillion a day since COVID, basically, hasn't it?
Well, that's what that's for a period of time, but they also claim that they stopped that. Right, but I'm now to the of the belief, and this is the same for all central banks around the world, they're just making shit up. They're saying they're doing stuff, but actually sort of finding some numbers to show it's what they're doing has been very difficult. So what I've done is I've stopped the numbers at this level, because if you don't get it at this level, you're not going to get it. Needless to say that they're printing money at such a level that the destruction of the system is now inevitable.
Yeah, right. And what they're doing with that money, I mean, I'm sure you're probably going to get this. What they're doing with that money is they're buying, in America at least, they're buying corporate America bonds.
Yeah. Well, what they did in the first bailouts was they just give it to the banks to hold the banking sector afloat. Right. And the money just disappeared into that black hole. This time around, they're actually buying assets. You know, the US Federal Reserve is actually buying corporate assets, you know, real estate, hard assets. So they're taking funny money and they're exchanging it for hard goods. And that's interesting, because now we've got the US Federal Reserve is not just the United States, but they're buying up stuff all over the planet.
Isn't that the definition of money laundering, or am I mistaken?
We will get to that, and you will struggle to find any other description. Okay. It's not just laundering. When we get there, and I describe how money is created, I'm going to ask you how this should be described.
Okay, and this is
yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, I know we're talking about US right now, but you highlighted already. This is not just the US. This is happening all over the world.
All over the world, and the worst offenders are probably China.
Yeah.
Right, but it doesn't matter because everything's so interlocked. So this time around, they're actually buying hard assets, and the US Fed is becoming now has quite a large portfolio. Now, what's interesting is what happens when you have a government institution merging with large corporate assets. We're seeing the restructuring of our financial system. It's a different set of rules, and when the curtain lifts in a few years, or whenever COVID finishes, and we also all right, what does the world look like now? It's going to be quite different. So before we get into the next part, this is to show that everything's actually connected. This was a study that was done. Hang on, there's the actual study. It's done by the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where they looked at the network of corporate control. And what they did, they wanted to know who owns what. And the first analysis ever conducted, Swiss economic researchers got a global network analysis of 43,000 of the most powerful transnational corporations, drawn from a sample of 37 million economic actors in the Orbis database. Right. So, and the resulting TNC network produced a graph with 600,000 nodes and 1 million ownership connections. So what they're basically saying is, of these corporations, who owns what? You know how companies often own shares in other companies.
Yep.
Right. So, and what they found was everything was connected. Everyone was interconnected. And you had, nations, firms like, say, the Bank of America owns lots and lots and lots. The results revealed a core of 787 firms that control 80% of the network, and a super entity in a bow-tied structure of 147 corporations that directly control 40% of revenue. Right.
I'm getting a bad feeling about this quantitative easing. I mean, I already had one, but I'm getting a bad feeling about it when I read that, hear that. And given that, like, the Fed in the US, and it's happening all over the place, is buying up company assets.
Yep. Physical assets. Right.
Physical assets.
Now, this is international, right? This is beyond boundaries and everything. But what's basically happening, when they have all these Oxfam studies where 62 people own the same amount of wealth as the poorer 3.6 billion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what they mean. This is where all the money is going. What is not in this analysis is people. Like, who are the people that own these companies? Yeah. And that's impossible to know because of tax haven law, which we will get to as well. Anyway, so you got this sort of basic sort of structure where they 37 million economic actors of the largest groups they could find, right? And they found, there was a core of 787 corporations that control about 80% of the network directly, and that's quite a lot of influence for everyone else. Then you had the bow tie structure. Within the bow tie structure, there was 21 hedge funds, and they didn't really quantify it because the true influence is not really known, right? And so you had a very centralized structure. And so, would this corporate entity do the right and ethical thing with regard to developing society on behalf of humanity at large? and are they democratically accountable? Well, no. Anyway, so here's the top 50 shareholders, the companies in that analysis. And you probably can't see it on your screen, but you got to go all the way down to the bottom one, the 50th company, which is China Petrochemical Group, before you get out of the financial system. Every single one of these are financial hedge funds and financial instrument houses. This is to show that the banking sector is at the heart of everything. They control everything. Also, what's been happening over time is in each industry is large companies that are absorbing their colleagues. Right. So back in this, it's not very clear. I couldn't get a clearer chart. But back in 1990 to 1995, you had the list along the left of banks, and they've all merged over time through mergers into 4 big banks: Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. Right. So the banking sector is heavily centralized. Now, big banking owns big oil. So US banking, the Bank of America, Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, and the European banks, which are all connected, by the way, the Deutsche Bank, BNP, Barclays, and several other old European groups own the 4 big boys of oil: ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, and Chevron. Right, so the monopoly over the global economy does not extend. According to the company 10K filings to the SEC, that is anything larger than 10K, the big banks are among the top 10 stockholders of virtually every Fortune 500 corporation. Right, so it's central. Let's just say it's centralized. Yep. Right, so how do you think big banking would respond to peak oil? They've also got all the money, so much money where more money doesn't really matter anymore, and what motivates them is probably power. and staying in power. If you've got all the money, more's not going to matter. All right. Can you see that slide? US dollar euro? Yeah? Has it come up yet?
Yep, I can see that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. This is the money supply in circulation from 1995 to 2013. Now, this is to show that the US dollar has the lion's share of it, and the euro. Before that, you had the Deutschmark and the French franc. But the orange section, which is this other, that's where groups like Russia and China sit. Right. So in the finance world, it's all about the US dollar and it's all about the euro. And they're also heavily interconnected, as in their currency reserve base, they have large portions of each other. So if one crashes, the other will follow pretty quickly. So it doesn't really matter who goes first.
So this is total money supply, not.
This is current money supply in circulation. I think this is M1.
M1. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So, excuse me. Okay. So this is one of the books I've. Hey.
So you need to get tested.
I need to get tested. I've got a.
Sorry.
I've got a tickle in my throat. Damn Chinese airport. Or the other one was, India was terrible. So no, Italy was terrible. Yeah. All right. So this is a book written by James Rickards. He did a lot of game theory stuff with the Pentagon. The Pentagon did some game theory work on what would happen in a financial crisis. Right. And so he wrote a couple of books, and this is one of them. In the US golden era of prosperity, that's the 1950s and 1960s, for every dollar of debt created, a ratio of $1 to $2.41 was in effect. That is, for every dollar printed, $2.41 in economic growth was generated. In 1970, just before President Nixon decoupled the gold standards to the US dollar, the ratio was $1 to 41 cents. For every dollar of debt created, 41 cents of economic growth was generated. In 2014, that ratio had fallen to $1 to 3 cents. For every dollar of debt created, 3 cents of economic growth was generated. So it's not sustainable or even useful in the short term. The current state of the US economy is its currency is now so debased that its purchasing power has been reduced by 97%. Right. Now, that's a quote from the book. Now, that is actually something that I've not. That was back in 2013. Now, here we are 7 years later. What is the real number now? And I haven't been able to find a sensible answer. Like, has it devalued further, or has it got to an asymptote where it's just not worth? It's just reached its saturation point. Right. So for the past 40 years, the US government debt creation has been approximately twice the rate of economic growth. This spiraling volume of debt since the 1970s has been unprecedented until then. What has facilitated to continue this was the Saudi Arabian commitment to price all of their oil contracts in US dollars. This is the Petrodollar Agreement. For the last 20 years, the increase in debt can be related to the higher cost of energy. As the cost of energy went up, there was a need to increase the volume of debt to the system to maintain growth. Right, so now we're starting to see that money and energy is actually connected. Through this presentation, I used some ideas that I saw in Chris Martinson's The Crash Course. These are it's peak prosperity now. Chris Martinson and Adam Taggart. The work that these guys do is excellent. They have managed to describe very clearly to the layperson some of these really complicated problems. These are their two books. I can recommend them. And in fact, when we get to the money creation section, what I've done is done my own version of what they presented. So kudos to them.
So this is great reading material.
Yeah, tip to the hat. And there's the multimedia presentation down there. It's like a 26-chapter YouTube that runs you through what's happening here. So
fantastic, right. and you'll be able to make these slides available so that anyone who wants to can click through that link later on. Yeah, without having cool.
I can send you those slides. It's 44 meg in PowerPoint, so I'll turn it into a PDF make it smaller.
Appreciate that, mate. Thank you.
All right, so let's get into a bit of history. Now, we can go back further, but there's been quite a few decisive points. What perhaps the most decisive was the choice to form a centralized bank, Federal Reserve Bank. In 1913, it was actually enacted in 1916. The book on the right-hand side, The Creature from Jekyll Island by Edward Griffin, G. Edward Griffin, that's as good as any sort of discussion of what we're looking at here. This institution had the authority to lend money into existence and set federal interest rates and set required banking reserves. The formation of the Federal Reserve happened behind closed doors, in secrecy, by people who would benefit the most. Basically, all the rich guys got together, and today it'd be considered illegal. In 2008, the terms of the bailout was written by the banks. Right?
Yeah, I remember that. I mean, isn't that putting the fox in charge of the hen house?
That's exactly what happened, right? But when you actually look at the nature of the system, that was inevitable, because that's what happened here too. In doing so, the Federal Reserve could step in and prevent financial panics from happening. Right? So it was formed. That's actually the newspaper clipping that is often used. Woodrow Wilson declared in his memoirs that he'd done a terrible thing. He wished he didn't. In the early 1900s, the American financial system was quite strong and prosperous. Industry was booming. The future looked very promising. But in 1907, there was a severe economic downturn, a financial crisis that took place over a 3-week starting period when the New York Stock Exchange fell almost 50% from its previous peak of the previous year. This was called the Panic of 1907. The panic was triggered by a failed attempt in October 1907 to corner the market in stock for the United Copper Company. J.P. Morgan stepped in as the lender of last resort. The banking sector and the voting public called for reform. Now, what's interesting is, where did that panic in 1907 come from? There is a school of thought that that was actually an orchestrated event amongst the big boys of finance. And the very same people who actually would then later write the Federal Reserve Act, because it was written for them. Right. Yep. So 1910, influential bankers met in secrecy. In attendance, Senator Nelson Aldrich, Nelson Rockefeller's maternal grandfather, Piat Andrew, an economist for the Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Norton, President of Morgan's First National Bank, Paul Moritz Warburg, a German who's a partner in the New York banking house of Kuhn and Loeb, Benjamin Strong, an aide to J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg. And Paul Warburg was credited as the architect of the bill. The bill passed in the House with an overwhelming majority, right, and then in the Senate. So the U.S. Federal Reserve was established with 3 key objectives: maximum employment, stable prices, moderate long-term interest rates, and they were made up of 10 member banks. And the 10 member banks at the inception were these: Rothschild Bank of London, Warburg Bank of Hamburg, Rothschild Bank of Berlin, Lehman Brothers of New York, Lazard Brothers of Paris, Kuhn-Loeb Bank of New York, Israel Moses CF Banks of Italy, Goldman Sachs of New York, Warburg Bank of Amsterdam, J.P. Morgan Chase of New York. Perhaps you recognize some of those names.
Oh, every one of them.
Right. Now, question: where is the federal government of the United States on that list? And how much do we get? Right. So it was a private sector banking. They got together and say, "Hey, let's change the system for our benefit, and we'll get the government to go along." Right, and they did. Right. So the key laws affecting the reserve have been the Banking Act, the Employment Act, Federal Reserve Department Accord, Federal Reserve Treasury Department Accord of, Bank Holding Company Act of, and amendments, Federal Reserve Reform Act, International Banking Act, Full Employment Balanced Growth Act, Depository Institutions Deregulation and Money Control Act, Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation Improvement Act, and the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act. So it's a massive transfer of wealth from one demographic to another. And do you know, to this day, the Federal Reserve has never been audited? Right. So who in 1970?
Why does that not surprise me?
Well, it's the nature of the system. You find the average person in the street, you go, no, that's not possible, or that's ridiculous. Everything's fine. Stop it with your shit.
Yep.
All right. So who owns the Federal Reserve Bank? This was found in an appendix in a report, but it references a Federal Reserve Directors, a study of corporate and banking influence, staff report, Committee on Banking, Currency and Housing, House of Representatives in the 94th Congress, second session, August 1976. Right. So this is actually a map. They attempted to reform the Federal Reserve back in 1977. Yeah, it didn't work, obviously. But anyway, this is who owned them at the time. Who actually owns the shareholders? Right at the top of the chain, Rothschild, NM Rothschild, London, Bank of England. They've since changed their names. But you've got Brown, you've got Morgan, Lazard Brothers, Montague, Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb. We've got Citibank, Rockefeller. There's multiple Rockefellers in here. J.P. Morgan, Baker, more Rockefellers. Yeah. Anyway, so you get the idea. Schiff,
Yep.
Harriman, the same groups that formed it in the beginning still owned it. Several decades later. People think this is a conspiracy theory, but these rich guys own the bank. It's as simple as that.
And if you ever wonder where the name or the concept of an old boys club came in,
yeah, well, yes, yeah, yeah. So then in 2009, this was the latest one I could find. Who owns the Federal Reserve? Now, at this time, we've got tax haven law in progress, so we can't actually know the people behind the actual companies, which is why tax havens are in place. So we've got Bank of America owns at the time most of it, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. So the big four banks own most of it, and then you had some minor shareholders. So the question: which of these banks got bailouts in 2008? They all did. Right. So then we get to the.
If I may, if they hadn't been bailed out, well, if they caused the bullshit.
Yep.
2008. If they hadn't been bailed out, they knew that if they hadn't been bailed out, and the government knew the whole financial system was probably going to come crashing down.
That is true, and it got within a few hours of that happening. I think they got within 5 or 6 hours of full paralysis. The problem is the system is so fragile that any sort of knock like that would have completely destroyed it, right? So, and what made it so fragile were decisions and choices made decades before.
Yep.
Right. So it's not an easy fix, and they were really looking into the abyss. And even if we play by the rules, not only are we dead, but the system will break back to its fundamental value, which was virtual. Right. So they were looking like
so they put a band-aid. Yeah. So they put a band-aid on a broken arm basically in 2009, and now 11 years later.
It's the choice was like, for example, if you're standing next to an exploding nuclear bomb and asking whether it's kiloton class or megaton class, you're just as dead. So I don't know the right answer here. What they could have done if they were sensible about it, they could have printed the money, but then they could have come clean and said, right, okay, we've now got a problem. We are now going to rebuild a new system. But that would mean they actually give up power. And that's not going to happen. So, but the nature of the system was truly boned, and there were no easy ways out. There were no polite ways. And we're in that same situation now, as it turns out, only worse. This is back to the structure. Italy's terrible. Most central banks in the world are administered by the BIS, which is the Bank of International Settlements. This was started by one of the Rothschild's banking holding systems. and it became the BIS. What it is it's a central bank that advises all other central banks. So the central banking systems all over the world. As of the year 2000, there were 7 countries without a Bank of International Settlements administered central bank. And they were Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. As of 2008, there were 5 countries: Sudan, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. And in 2011, there were 3 countries: Cuba, North Korea, and Iran. Now, put this in context. There's the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's the war in Libya and Sudan. And there is the attempted war in Iran and North Korea. And since around 2012, thereabouts, the things for the Anglo banking cartel have just not gone to plan. And the real trouble started when, in Syria, when they tried yet another one of these wars in Syria, the Russians intervened. Right, and that put the kibosh on their plans for that. And that was the first time they were openly challenged. But that right there is, you got the link between, give war a chance. So you have like this relationship. The chart shows a relationship for the majority shareholders, the banks that are majority shareholders in oil companies. This is within the United States, and electrical utility companies, implying monopoly of currency issuing oil and electrical utility entities by the Fed majority shareholders. So you have a situation where there's the Trilateral Commission in the center, and so you have this sort of situation where the main shareholders who own the US Fed also happen to own all the other things as well. And so you have this system where a very small number of people hold an enormous amount of authority across lots of areas. And so they're operating in a way where they're favored and everyone else is drained. So, yeah. So, all right, that's your basic structure. Of course, there's more to it than that, but it's just a taste.
And the Petrodollar Agreement again was when?
Oh, we'll get to that. 1973. Yeah. That's coming. Right. I'm trying to do this in a chronological order. Okay, the Great Depression, 1929. Instead of preventing panics, the Federal Reserve provided the mechanism that facilitated a massive speculative bubble. And when the bubble burst, it created the Great Depression. The US money supply contracted by almost a third in volume, and the US administration approached the point where it was required to declare itself insolvent. Right. So depressions happen and everything, and there's a great deal of debate around, what this was or what caused it, was it necessary, and all that. So anyway, so what happens in these situations and what do people do about it? Like the governments, for example, can we trust them? In 1933, US President Roosevelt ordered the confiscation of all gold holdings from all sectors. Now this is the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot happening behind the scenes on this one, including privately held assets of citizens. And they enacted Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin and gold bullion and gold certificates within the continental United States. Gold assets would be turned over to the Federal Reserve Bank in exchange for US dollars and, in some cases, gold certificates. At this time, the US dollar was backed by the gold standard. Now, I don't know if they actually got as far as going and confiscating the gold, but this is what they suggest to everyone. But this is sort of when the US broke with the gold standard in internal philosophy. Later, what they told the rest of the world was, we're backed by gold, but actually they themselves broke that philosophy internally. And in 1931, 2 years earlier, the Bank of England did the same thing. So, the Great Depression really did create a maelstrom of difficulty right around the world. So, assets gained by the Federal Reserve in this action was estimated at $11 billion. So, the Federal Reserve gained absolute control of the entire gold reserves of the most powerful economically, politically, and military nation on the earth at the time. In exchange for $11 billion, it created a thin air. They printed it. This is an excellent example of how nation-state governments will change the rules and even break the law to achieve its goals in times of stress. Yeah, so that brings us to 1944. World War II had happened. This was the gathering of the world's most powerful economic nations, who incidentally had just won World War II, because, to meet and form the Bretton Woods Agreement, where all of the currencies were at some level tied to the gold standard. In recognition that the US represented more than half the world economy at the time and controlled most of the gold, the US dollar was made the de facto world reserve currency, and all other currencies were pegged to the US dollar. And it ushered in an era of economic prosperity relatively free of risk. This was the golden era. So the graph on the left there, you can see that in the number of countries having banking crises in each year since 1800, the Bretton Woods era was an unprecedented era of stability. So,
curious.
Now the system was flawed. The US Federal Reserve could print money, and it did, because every time the US wanted to do something, it could just spend money and then print money to balance the books. And it set itself up as the heart of an empire without saying so. So a lot of money was spent geopolitically, especially things like the Cold War and the arms race and all that. The Vietnam War was very expensive. So the system was flawed. There was no prevention to limit the Federal Reserve creating more dollars and expand the US money supply. It soon became clear that more US dollars in circulation than the same value of gold, and that the US dollars were devaluing. French President Charles de Gaulle demanded that French US dollar holdings be converted back to gold and returned to France. And the gold reserves were depleting and becoming very low. Right. So for half a century, Americans could trade $20.67 for an ounce of gold. That was the rate. And to help combat the depression faced with mounting unemployment, the US government found it could do little to stimulate the economy. And to deter people from cashing in on deposits and depleting the gold supply, the US and other governments had to keep the interest rates high, but that made it too expensive for people or a business to borrow. And that is the environment that they did the Order 6102, the hoarding of gold. They'd lost control, basically. So in 1933, Roosevelt cut the dollar's ties with gold, allowing governments to pump money into the economy at lower interest rates. Most economists now agree 90% of the reason why the US got out of the Great Depression was the break with gold. Claims one author, Lords of Finance, Liaquat Ahmed. In 1971, things had gone too far. Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system agreement and decoupled the dollar from the gold standard to stop dollar flush foreigners from sapping gold reserves. So understanding gold has to be understood. Oil, finance, and gold are the three pillars of the system that you need to understand.
Yeah. Yep. So people, basically, other countries had lots of US dollars.
Yeah.
And since it was pegged at a fixed rate to gold, they're like, okay, we don't trust you. Just give us gold. Of course, the US knew this was not going to be beneficial to them, so they
that's right.
End the problem agreement and.
The US had put themselves at the center of the situation, but they didn't curtail their spending responsibly, knowing that they could just balance their budget by printing more money. They didn't understand the long-term implications of that. So here's Tricky Dicky. So with the removal of the last restraint of the gold standard requirements, the Federal Reserve could print as much money as it liked. Dollars are loaned into existence through debt, and the US debt ballooned from this point. With the benefit of 2020 hindsight, it's become clear that the United States has used its geopolitical position to further its interests to increase its footprint on the global market, much like what the Chinese are doing now. The Anglo-American banking elite were able to secretly establish and maintain their power by riding off the success of World War II. This is another book to read, The Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. It's an old book. But some of the stuff it's highly relevant understanding how we got here. This brings us to 1973 and the Petrodollar Agreement. Now, petrodollar is any oil purchase or trade by an oil exporting country to be done in US dollars. At the time, up until 1970, the US was the largest oil producer in the world, and Saudi Arabia took over their position around then.
Okay,
so the oil was coupled with oil production. The US dollar was coupled with oil production. By pricing all contracts in USDs forming the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia became the dominant producer. In exchange, the US military would protect the House of Saud from all adversaries, domestic and foreign. right? So the House of Sword basically got them their bodyguard to stay in power, and the US got their Petrodollar Agreement, which was the new reason to be. Now that Bretton Woods was done. And since the dollar is the global reserve currency, all international transactions are priced in dollars. Now, what that meant was that Petrodollar Agreement forced the entire global market to use and engage in the US dollar fiat currency system, which was ballooning in debt. And we had no choice. So read these two books, The American House of Sword, The Secret Petrodollar Connection by Stephen Emerson, and The House of Bush, House of Sword, The Secret Relationship Between the World's Two Most Powerful Dynasties. Right, that lays it out pretty clearly. Right. So what does that look like? So here we get to this point where we have the same data as before that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, but now I've actually pinned the month 1970, January, and the number 100, and that's here. And so prior to that, things are pretty stable. Not if you zoom in on that, it would expand out. But in 1973, the oil embargo and Petrodollar Agreement, that was the first time that they were hit with a very serious geopolitical challenge, and they just printed money out of it. And you can sort of see that that's the full data. Zooming in on the bottom there, you can sort of see the structure itself. Mm-hmm. Things blew out. So the 1971 decoupling decision was actually more significant than the 2005 blowout. Right, and so at this point, the whole thing was a fiction. So, and then we go to, well, let's just look at the metals like aluminium, copper, and down to nickel, and you're seeing the same structures. And so, from 1971 onwards till about 2003, you've got this relatively stable band, but it's still much more volatile than it was before. And then post 2005, it just went crazy. So,
wow.
And there's gold, platinum, and silver, but gold in particular. Gold was decoupled from money, and it became like an asset that, the idea it wasn't money anymore, but central banks used to sort of purchase it and sort of keep it. And so this is the sort of thing as we move into cryptocurrencies, if we move into cryptocurrencies, but it's this kind of decision that has these kind of ramifications. Right, so that brings us to this graph that I showed you in the last podcast, is where I've actually sort of indexed GDP and oil production to the number 100 and the year 1965. And so things were pretty good they overlaid beautifully. And then when they decoupled from the gold standard, they started to diverge. And that's what that chart now looks like now.
You mentioned cryptocurrencies, right? So yeah. Okay, gold is something you physically touch and hold and mold into jewelry or statues or whatever the hell you want to mold it into, right? But a fiat currency, there is no difference between a fiat currency and a cryptocurrency.
That is correct. That is, in fact, a fiat currency, everything happens behind closed doors and no one knows what's going on, and some monkey business comes out. But a fiat currency is actually much more transparent. Now, all of these systems will work if we have a agreement if we have agreement on how we're going to use these systems, right? If everyone agrees to the rules and everyone follows the rules, it'll work as a medium of exchange. It's when people in positions of authority do not do that and weaponize the laws for their own benefit. That's when things fall apart. And so now we're down to human nature. Is it going to work? I don't know. So the whole cryptocurrency idea was what you see is what you get. You can actually check what it is. Will it work? I don't know. I do think that if governments can't collect tax in some form, then it won't be allowed. So
no, sure, but what's the relevance of governance? Let's not go too far down. That was probably different, probably for a topic for a different conversation. But bottom line is, what is it the government's left to do? Civil defense, national defense, infrastructure. When you have communities as big as Facebook and whatever, If they were to, because they have the marketplace, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Google, they have the marketplace, they have the people, they are their own countries of 1 billion people plus. If they have a currency, what's left?
See, you've got the problem of all of these human systems that we've done so far, like, capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism even, they're all based around the idea of growth, right? That the future is larger than the past. Now that we've hit some energy barriers, that's not going to happen anymore unless something spectacular happens. But the way what things look at the moment is the future cannot be more energy rich than the past, which now we're gearing into the economics of contraction, not the economics of growth. And any given human system that we've got so far is not going to work. Right, so we're in an unprecedented time in context of what do we do now. The traditional way of managing something when there's not enough to go around is give war a chance. And we're seeing a bit of that at the moment, where the very rich are hoovering up all the wealth in one form or another, and then going to extreme lengths to control and contain the rest of the public. Right, so that's a discussion. Anyway, moving on. So this is what we are. So this is such a complicated set of concepts that you can't deal with quickly. So here's what we're in at the moment, where promises of future goods and services versus actual goods and services, the physical economy versus the fiat economy, they've diverged. Some of these ideas I got from reading Gail Tverberg's work. She does a blog called Our Finite World. The link's down below. I highly recommend people go and look at her blog. She does excellent work. She's got a really good handle on how things interrelate. She used to be an actuary, right? So she's got a talent for numbers, and she reviewed one of my reports, and her intellect, her ability to absorb information, understand what it means, is excellent. Anyway, moving on. So we're in this situation where things have diverged, promises versus actual goods, and we're not going to be able to meet those obligations. So, yeah. Okay, so now we're getting to money creation.
Seeing a pattern here, by the
way. Yes, most people can. There are two types of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system that's operating at the moment. And you've got the central bank that creates money, but you've also got a commercial bank that creates money by, and we'll go through those in when a deposit of a central bank money is made into a commercial bank, the central bank money is removed from circulation and added to the commercial bank's reserves. It's no longer counted as part of M1 supply. Simultaneously, an equal amount of new commercial bank money is created in the form of bank deposits. Right, so this is just, it's like a form of alchemy where they just create something out of thin air. The exact mechanism behind the creation of commercial bank has been a controversial issue, and they leave it at that. They just say, oh, it's controversial. They don't know when you actually look at their own documentation. Right, so a central bank is a reserve bank, or a monetary authority is an institution that manages the currency, money supply, and interest rates of a state or formal monetary union and oversees the commercial banking system. Compared to a commercial bank, a central bank possesses a monopoly on increasing the monetary base in a financial crisis. Central bank sets the rules of what can be done. Most central banks also have supervisory and regulatory powers to ensure the stability of member institutions, to prevent bank runs, and to discourage reckless or fraudulent behavior by member banks. And central banks in most developed nations are institutionally independent from political interference, as in they're a private institution. It's like the United States is the same as Australia, whereas the money creation supply is no longer attached to a democratically accountable institution like a political administration, but they have literally life and death control over our system. And so the richest people in the world have just bought their way in. So
yeah, because I mean, you're talking about the member banks. Basically, some of the member banks are the people who run the central bank.
That's right. That's exactly right. You look behind the curtain, you think, what? All right, right. Strap yourself in, Dorothy. You're not in Kansas anymore. Right. So how do we do this fractional reserve banking thing? Like, what they've done is it's not new. Like the first example of fractional reserve banking goes back to, say, the Medicis in the 14th century, 14th, 15th century medieval Europe. That they've decided to actually make it the standard in all finance in our industrial economy, I think, was a mistake. What they've basically done is, I'm going to go through an example, is currently a reserve of 10% is required by the Federal Reserve Bank for a bank to keep, which means they could lend out 90% of its deposits and charge interest in doing so. Right. So what does that mean? Now, here's a quote that I got from Chris Martinson in the Crash Course, and it's brilliant. "The process which money is created is so simple that the mind is repelled." John Kenneth Galbraith. True. Watch this. Let's have a thought experiment.
Mhm.
Let's say a person has $1,000 and he goes and deposits in the bank. Right, and let's say this bank is just opening for the first time, and so this is the starting of the deposit. Right, the bank opens, 0 reserves. At this point, there's $1,000 in the banking system, and the bank holds 0 in reserve. And so, according to the Federal Reserve, by law, it must keep its 10% of the fractional reserve, which is $100, but it can loan out $900. So the bank loans person 2 $900. Person 2 uses the money in the market and spends it by engaging in business A. Right, so $900 is given to business A. Business A needs to deposit the earned money into the bank as an acceptable method of risk mitigation. So business A deposits $900 into the bank. Now, in macro terms, we've got like all banks are actually connected together. This is in terms of money supply. And so all banks are treated as one entity in this thought experiment. So at this point, there's $1,900 in the banking system, and the bank holds $100 in reserve. So with $900 in the bank is just received, it must keep 10%, which reserve is $90. So the bank loans out $810 to person 3. Person 3 spends that money at business B, and business B now has $810 in earnings. Okay. So business B deposits in the bank, and at this point the banking system has $2,710, of which it is required to hold just $190 as reserve. So with the $810 in the bank that's just received, it must keep a 10% held in reserve, which is $81. The bank loans the remaining $729 to person 4. Person 4 uses the money in business C. Business C deposits the money. At this point, the bank has $3,439, of which it's required to hold just $343.90 in reserve. So at this point, we started with $1,000, right? But the bank is owed $4,640.43 over time. Now, if I, yeah, right. So I take the thought experiment, and you keep going for that original $1,000. How many times can it be loaned out? And you get down to $9,999.76 in terms of deposits, keeping the full $1,000 in reserve. Total revenue of $13,493, but then they charge interest on top of that at 3% per annum compounded monthly, and it looks like this, right? So, right. So
yeah.
the money, right. So hang on. So that first $1,000 was turned into 13,000, right? And what's interesting, it's backed by physical assets and collateral. People will work to pay that off. Right, so it's actual been pulled out of thin air and it's been turned into physical work. Right, so it's also created by money's also created by central banks. Where did that $1,000 come from? So here are some references. There's Jim Rickard's book, and there's a couple other references chase up. Also, check out some of Nicole Foss's work on YouTube. She has done some excellent work in describing this, because she thinks in terms of systems. and she's been able to describe this complicated system. The one I like to hand around is a 2015 interview of Nicole Foss on YouTube. Right. So where did this original $1,000 come from? Well, okay. The U.S. Congress votes to increase money supply to balance its budget. All right. So that's the first step. The Congress cannot actually do this, so it sends the directive to the U.S. Treasury. Right, so they vote to do it, then the US Treasury said, right, give us the money. The US Treasury prints up a series of bond certificates of Treasury bonds. Now, the Treasury has like a couple of weeks' money supply in hand, so it can't, just pay for it out of its coffers. So it prints up the Treasury bonds, and then it sells those bonds. Step 4, Treasury bonds are sold in an auction, usually bought by central banks and large private banks around the world. It's a way of foreign nation states to have US money in their own Treasury reserve. It's also a way of actually and it's believed most of these bonds are now purchased by the Federal Reserve Bank anonymously, which is illegal, but that's what they think is happening. Step 5, the money is used to purchase the Treasury bonds is transferred back into the US Treasury vaults. And step 6, the money gets distributed through a variety of government departments and programs, defense spending and social security and what have you. So, okay, that's the Treasury. So they just printed up some money and they've sold it. And they go, okay, off we go. And now we have no more money. Step 7, the Federal Reserve can then buy those Treasury bonds from a bank to the open market. The Fed cannot buy bonds directly, according to the law, from the Treasury. The Federal Reserve Act specifies it may buy and sell Treasury securities only in the open market. The Federal Reserve meets this statutory requirement by conducting its purchases and sales of securities chiefly through transactions with a group of major financial firms, primary dealers, that have established a trading relationship with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. These transactions are commonly referred to in the open market operations and are the main tool when the Fed Reserve adjusts its holdings. Right, so the Fed just buys it. But hang on, the Fed doesn't have a bank account. Right? So, and it does this by electronically inventing numbers. So the bonds are, the central bank buys the bond by transferring the money to the bank, and it's done by just inventing electronic numbers. The bond has been swapped by electronic numbers drafted out of thin air. So this is what we call quantitative easing.
And I know a lot of people at this point are going to be saying this can't be the way it works, but it is.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying is go to Chris Martinson's crash course. I think it's chapter 7 and 8, where they go through this and watch it about 10 times, and you'll still go, huh? What? So quantitative easing.
And if you think it doesn't happen in your country, think again.
Yeah. Any central bank will do this. Right. Step 7 is where the money's created. When the Federal Reserve Bank writes a check or does a money transfer, it does not do so by drawing money from large physical vault. It just creates the money out of nothing. And it just edits an electronic database and then loans it to the American taxpayer with interest. Now, from their own publications, from the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in their account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check where there's no bank deposit on the check is drawn, then the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. It's as simple as that. Money is created. Created money is exchanged for Treasury bond, mortgage-backed securities, and or corporate debt. And that is now termed quantitative easing. What? How is this legal? People go to jail for not paying their taxes. What? So you got this spiral, where there's a perception that the future economy will always grow, and so changes in economic activity, changes happen to consumption of everything. Prices go up. Changes in the real economy change. Everything depends on, this is the energy example, expansion of GDP due to greater revenue flow, which justifies more debt. More debt is considered to generate more capital growth, more debt is considered to generate capital to stimulate economic growth. Changes to credit and debt, more debt taken on, quantitative easing done by the central bank. And it goes round and round and round. You go, come on, man. So it's a system requirement. The system must grow. And it has to pay for the outstanding debt, which is always larger than the ability to service the debt. That what is owed is always larger than the principal. And so the rate of change is defined by the interest owed on all the outstanding debt. And that in its nutshell is why the system must grow. So let's look at some numbers in terms of, well, how much debt is being held. Now, when you see a flag up in the top right-hand corner, it's, that's the country that's being discussed. And this is the U.S. federal debt by the U.S. Up until 1790, up until 2010. And you can see that. This is where it was in 2015. But the previous graph that you see is a percentage of GDP. And because GDP is going up, you think, oh, it's all good. But actually, we've got a form of inflation happening here. That's the actual debt. Now, in 2014, that debt was 16 trillion, 16.5 trillion.
This I don't dare ask what it is today.
Well, this is what I pulled up yesterday, or day before, sorry. This is the US debt clock, usdebtclock.org, and it gives you like an up-to-date version, 26.4 trillion. There's a couple of numbers here. US gross domestic product is a little under 20 trillion. Okay, that's the good news. US national debt, 26.4 trillion. US debt GDP ratio, 132%. But when they say debt, what do they mean by that? Because, well, US derivatives contracts held by US financial institutions, 686 trillion. We'll get to derivatives in a minute, but yeah, how is that ever going to be paid back? That's what they think they're.
Sorry, that's not going to be paid back.
No. US derivatives are a credit default swap. It's a contract.
Mm-hmm.
These are contracts that the US government is owed. Is owed and owes in exchange. It's like an exchange system. Some are owed, some are owed to. Right, but there's 686 trillion US dollars worth of derivatives inside the US government system. Right, that's like the powder keg. Now, here's the real problem: US unfunded liabilities, things like Social Security and pension and all that, and infrastructure. That's 153 trillion at the moment. That's the stuff that they're required to do. Right, so these numbers, the situation's out of control. So now let's look at how much of this debt has grown under each president. Now, that's in the beginning there was quite not very much debt, but lately with each passing president, that's blown out of proportion. This is the purpose of this slide, is to show that this is a systemic thing. It has nothing to do with politics at all. Yeah. Okay, Donald Trump, he's brought on 4.78 trillion in his presidency. Okay, he had the COVID-19 thing, which a surprising amount of money has been printed. And George Bush, he oversaw the global financial crisis, which was, that's when the quantitative easing sort of took off. But Barack Obama in the middle had more than both of them. Right, so...
What was his excuse?
They don't give one.
Right.
They just don't give one. But what you've got is a situation where this is definitely nothing to do with politics at all. You see all the pundits at the moment. Everything is Donald Trump's fault, but they steer clear of these sorts of discussions about what is actually the nature of the system that underlies everything. Anyway, so that's the US. The foreign holders of the US debt in 2019. Japan bought a whole lot, and they bought a whole lot as part of their, when they printed a lot of money themselves in stimulus, right? That's what they did with their money. They bought a lot of US debt. I know. Yeah, I know.
So Japan wants to buy treasury bonds in the US, so they just issue some ones and zeros on a screen.
Yep. And remember, all of these banks are interconnected. And remember the interconnected corporate ownership as well. So it's a shell game. It's one big giant shell game.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the Fed balance sheet. This is the stuff they'll admit to. There's a whole lot of stuff in the shadow banking system that is not. It's like off the books. So that they do a whole lot of stuff that's really sort of dodgy. But this is the stuff they've admitted to. So there's QE 1, 2, and 3, and we got to about there. And this spike at the end here is COVID-19. the COVID-19 response. And I haven't had much data collected for that because I didn't think we'd get the time. But what's happening now really is unprecedented. It's actually much more serious. It's another blowout like 2005.
I mean, not to blow smoke up Trump's pipe, right?
Yep.
But by looking at this, it's sort of like there's 2016 where he comes in, and it's sort of okay. He's taken it over pretty flat from Obama by the looks of it, just pre-2016, but he's kept it going flat, and then then it's gone down, and
hang on,
this little got kicked out. Okay,
and I got kicked out.
So we just need to get that presentation back up.
Yeah. Yep. So I don't know.
So
where are we? Okay, we're on
that one. Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
So he starts to reduce it, and then I imagine this little dip where there's a little hump there before it goes exponential is the beginning of COVID.
Yeah.
Timeline. Yeah. So again, not to blow smoke up Trump's pipe, because I know there'll be a lot of people watching this who'll be, for the DNC as opposed to the GOP or whatever. So I don't want to go down that route, because you're right, like you say, this is not about one or the other political party. This is
a fundamental system. Yeah. And in fact, all the stuff we're seeing in America at the moment is trying to convince the people with the pitchforks to argue with the people with the burning torches that they're the enemy, instead of cooperating and then facing the real set of problems together. There's no discernible difference between these politicians. It's the underlying system. And so,
well, it begs the question: who's pulling the strings of the different political parties?
There's an error there.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, if both political parties are going after the same, it's running the same basic strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see that, by the way?
Yeah, got the clock up there. Yeah. So if they're both run the same strategy, deflecting from the real issue, just covering up the reality of how the system is defunct, then it begs the question: who's pulling the strings? Who is the overlord that keeps them in place? Because if there's no one above, surely someone would step up and say, you know what, this is all screwed and this is the way it is. But someone's keeping it in place, or someone.
I see it as a criminal organized crime cabal, right? That they've gotten hold of everything, and it's a shell game where the numbers no longer mean anything. So all right, so that's a conversation that will last hours. We probably do
we'll come back and have another one about that.
So okay, here's the debt clock for other countries. When you see the debt GDP ratio over 90%, that is when the economy is now having to go further into debt to maintain that debt and service its own economy. So 90% is crossing the Rubicon, and almost all of these countries have more than that. So it's not going to. All right. So derivatives. This is hilarious. You thought we got to the end of the jokes, but no, I'm here all week. Right. What's a derivative? A derivative is a financial instrument whose value is derived from the value of another asset known as the underlying. When the price of the underlying changes, the value of the derivative also changes. A derivative is not a product, but it is a contract that derives the value from changes of the price of the underlying. As far as I can tell, a derivative is a bet on what the future value of something's going to be.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah, right. So it's quite an old institution, but it was deregulated in the early 2000s, the year 2000. And from that point on, it's just gotten silly. Crude oil is the most heavily traded in the derivatives market landscape. So, okay. So what's the derivatives volume? So here is the top here, German GDP. This is in 2014 when I did this calculation. 2014, 3.88 trillion. It's a log scale, right? China GDP at the time was 11.2 trillion. Europe was 18.59, and US was 17.4, and the global GDP was a little under 80 trillion. How much in terms of derivatives do you think there is? Just guess.
2014. It's got to be, isn't it? It's got to be like exponentially more, right?
It's a silly number. Look at this. Remember, that's a log scale. 1.28 quadrillion. Now, it's an estimate. Is that number real? I have no idea, and I've yet to actually find any credible information that is real. The US exposure to derivatives at the time was 538 trillion. You saw on the debt clock that is 600 and something now. The Deutsche Bank on its own has $75 trillion worth of derivatives, which, you know, if they're called in, what happens to the Deutsche Bank? It fails. What happens to the German economy? Well, you know, and that sets off a chain reaction. So,
and derivatives are they're basically bets, and they're being bet on a whole gambit of things.
Yeah, and as I understand it, derivatives are not so much cashed out; they're traded, which is why we've got to this ridiculous volume. And at some point, they get cashed out. So, global debt. When we're saying like the US owes 26 trillion, like, well, out there's like 237 trillion. Right. That was in 2017. So that's what I'm saying. These numbers don't mean anything anymore. No. In the world of debt, the United States has about 31%, Japan has 17%, and China has 9.8%.
Yeah.
All right. So in terms of the world economy, this is the GDP. United States has the best GDP. It's the biggest market. Europe is the green bit, and so on. But we're all saturated in debt. So the world reserve currencies, this is the total allocated exchange reserves by currency. There is the US dollar is most of it, followed by the Europe. Then there's the Japanese yen. There's the Chinese renminbi down the bottom, right? So, so the financial export services around the world, the US, UK, and Luxembourg hold the core of it. That's the Asian cluster over here. But the sheer size of the Anglo banking system, it's just bloated out of control. Now, this will make you laugh. This is actually the total currency in circulation. Gold, 8.7 trillion, US dollar 1.7, and then euro. But look up here, Bitcoin. Bitcoin shows up. There's more Bitcoin than there are Russian rubles or British UK sterling pounds. And
wow.
So that, yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So all major central banks are printing money. So let's have a look at what they're doing. There's our money definition, you know, M1, M2, M3, and all that. M1 is defined as the demand, M0 plus demand deposits, known as the sight deposits, or it's what's in the bank.
Mm-hmm.
M2 is your money and close substitutes, as in M1 plus small savings and time deposits, known as term deposits, and so on. M3 is borrowed money, defined as M2 plus large time deposits, institutional market money funds, short term, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of jargon here that the average person will just look at this and go, what? I don't get it. But there's also a lot of smoke and mirrors to hide the shell game. That's what I'm saying.
And just I was going to say, just before we go on, you know, a lot of people will be listening to this and like, I don't get it. It's really something for economists and academics. And I'm saying to you, no, this is something that every person needs to get their head around, because when you do, you're going to say it's enough.
Your hair will curl.
Yeah.
What I like to say to people is you probably won't see your superannuation.
No.
And the reason why that is in this stuff. And so it would behove everyone to understand it and not simply trust the money men to do the right thing by us all.
All right. Your super is just their next fund.
Yes. That's going to be great. Yeah. All right. So here's the estimated global currency in circulation over from 1971 to 2009. US dollar is the green, euro is the blue, and the yen is the brown. The Japanese yen, they printed it to death. $1.4 trillion in quantitative easing was authorized, and okay, well that's it, they're done. So now derivatives were deregulated in 2001, and from that point they just started printing money, and it went into derivatives, the oil and gas market in particular. Right, but all major currencies valued by gold, like over the last 20 years, has been in a steady decline. And yeah, yeah, it's well. We'll get to gold. Gold is not necessarily the safe haven we think. Right, so here's the United States M1 supply from 1959.
Because when you talk about money, sorry, when you talk about that last slide, where yeah. So just in case people are wondering what that is the value of that's the amount of gold for equal value, or the value of the dollar, the currency versus actual same amount of gold.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So here's the amount of money in supply. That this is the road to hyperinflation. So this is over history. There is no QE1 start, and that's when the thing started to go crazy. And that little spike there is the COVID-19 spike. So now going into this is July 2019 to April 2020, same graph. So that is this the last 2 or 3 pixels blown up is that graph. Right. So yeah. Okay. So all right. So now there's the purchasing power of the dollar. It's fallen. It's fallen a lot. So what that basically means is for you to go out and buy physical goods, like a loaf of bread. If you were to buy a loaf of bread in 1913, how much would it cost versus how much would it cost in 2019? Right, so that's the United States. Let's look at Europe. See, everyone often sort of bashes the United States like they're the only ones doing this and they're the source of all trouble.
Yep.
They're the source of some trouble. They might even have more responsible for more monkey business than anyone else. But they're certainly not the only ones. This is Europe. Money supply, same story. It's been going up steadily. Europe will struggle to stay Europe. This is a situation where all these European central banks and nation states owe each other money. It's like a chain reaction. I actually had a couple of clips I was going to play. I don't know if we have time.
Yeah, sure.
Because this actually, do you remember Clark and Dawes? Do you remember these guys?
Yes, I do.
Right. Well, this was presented in 2010, and so I'm going to see if this works.
Okay.
See if this works. Where are you? Stream, share screen, application. Okay. Can you see him?
Yes. Let's see if the audio comes through.
Yeah. No, this is a joke. This is tabled as a joke, but it highlights a deadly serious situation that still exists.
Roger, yes. Roger. Ah, that's your name.
Is it working?
Good. And what do you do, Roger?
I'm a financial consultant.
Ah, financial consultant, eh?
Roger,
yeah,
yes.
Terrific. And Roger, how's business at the moment?
Not bad, thank you. Been a bit quiet lately.
How do you mean lately?
Since the war, been a bit quiet.
Fair enough. Okay, Roger, your special subject tonight is the economies of the European community. Your time starts now. Best of luck.
Thank you.
How much does Greece owe, Roger?
$367 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Mostly to the other European economies.
Correct. How much does Ireland owe?
$865 billion.
Correct. And who do they owe it to?
Other European economies mostly.
Correct. How much do Spain and Italy owe?
$1 trillion each.
Correct. Who to?
And then Germany.
Correct. And how are Germany, France and Britain going, Roger?
Well, they're struggling a bit, aren't they?
Correct. Why?
Because they've lent all these vast amounts of money to other European economies that can't possibly pay them back.
Correct. So what are they going to do?
They're going to have to bail them out.
Correct. Where are they getting the money to do that, Roger?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one.
How much does Portugal owe?
Hang on a minute. What was the answer to that earlier question?
Just keep answering the questions, Roger. Where is Portugal going to get the money it owes to Germany if Germany can't get back the money that it lent to Italy?
Just a minute. What was the answer to the previous question? The question was, how can broke economies lend money to other broke economies who haven't got any money because they can't pay back the money the broke economy lent to the other broke economy and shouldn't have lent it to them in the first place because the broke economy can't pay it back?
You're wasting very valuable time, Roger. How much money does Spain owe to Italy?
$41 billion, but where are they going to get it?
Correct. What does Italy owe to Spain?
$27 billion, but they haven't got it. They're broke.
Correct. How can they pay each other if neither of them has any money?
They're going to get a bailout, aren't they?
Correct. And where's the money coming from for the bailout?
That's what I'm asking you.
Correct. Why are people selling the European currency and buying the US dollar?
Because the US economy is so much stronger than the European economy.
Correct. Why is that, Roger?
Because it's owned by China.
Correct. And very well done. And after that round, you've lost $1 million.
I've lost $1 million. I thought you said well done.
Yes, well done. You've only lost $1 million. That's an extraordinary performance, Roger.
I've only lost $1 million.
Very well done.
And that's quite good, is it?
Oh, it's excellent.
Sell everything immediately. Quickly.
Did that work?
That worked, yeah.
Right.
Oh my God.
But that's actually the okay. Can you see him again? Has the presentation come up?
Yep, it has. Yep.
Okay, that's the situation we're in now. That was a joke, and it's 10 years old now, but the numbers are the same, and we're seeing that every time. For example, when the Catalan group tried to secede from Spain, there was a draconian response, and the European Union backed them. That's why. Yeah. Anyway, so all right, moving on. China. Now, this is China. They've been there's a lot of information here to show they have not been, how do you say, fair actors in this. They're openly doing dodgy things, but they're not the only ones doing dodgy things, right? So the money's been steadily increasing. They had a reset in 2015. And they had quantitative easing restrictions applied, but they still had like an increase in money supply. Now, to put this in context, the yuan has steadily what's called appreciated, and a devalued currency allows the ability to undercut the competition. So they've been devaluing their currency. There's the GFC period there, and that's not a natural pattern. So, but put that up against, while the United States was printing cash, that's what the Chinese are doing. Wow. That was quantitative easing. They had 5 trillion. They printed more money faster than anyone else. Right. So,
if you want to know how they're financing their Belt and Road Initiative, apart from their low-cost loans from the International Monetary Fund.
That's exactly right. And remember the shell game, though. I believe there's a strategy going on where everyone understands there's a reset going, and it happens to everyone all at once. So when the reset happens, who owns what in physical terms? Who's got what? And then they look at the new system. So this is the trade deficit with China. The United States finds itself in, where more's coming in from China than is going out to China. So this is the trade war that's actually sort of going down at the moment. But the merchandise trade balance, they've had a problem for a long time. So this goes 1895 to 2015. This is the trade balance between the US and everyone else. So they were an export nation up until about 1970. That was when economically they were in trouble. That's why they had to decouple from the gold standard. They had a lot of economic problems. It was getting to the point where they might have to declare insolvency. But those problems started in their decline in the mid-1960s. Right, so everything started going pear-shaped, and they thought, well, we've got to do something. So they started printing money, but in that world, everything moved offshore, and this is actually when the Chinese started actually sort of their rise to their current position. So All right, United Kingdom, same thing. See this steady increase, this nice smooth increase. It's not like they just suddenly started to do it in 2008. And so, same thing. The purchasing power of the British pound. The British pound left the gold standard in 1931, and then became attached to the sterling silver, as in the pound sterling. And they also then floated and became a full fiat currency in 1971. So, right. So that's what I'm saying. It's not just the US dollar that went through these conniptions. It's the whole system all at once. Right. There's Japan. So same thing. They had a slightly different profile. They had the Asian financial crisis to deal with. What happened there? Why am I? It doesn't seem to like some of these charts. Hang on, let me just navigate my way back there. Okay, can you see that? Japan purchasing power.
Yep, got that.
Okay, all right. In circulation, so their purchasing power has also gone down. Here's Australia. Good old Australia. When derivatives were deregulated, the thing started to go crazy. But our purchasing power from 1971, because we're tied to the US dollar, has dropped. Oh well. And now they're starting to do quantitative easing for the first time. Right, so everyone prints their own money with no backing. So in 2008, and so I started printing these in a color printer. And what you do is you print them out, and you leave them on the floor. People think they're a real $20 note. So, all right. So here's some historical episodes of hyperinflation. Rome, World War I, World War II. It's understood how this will go. The shock doctrine by Naomi Klein described very nicely what happened in Latin America. Especially the actions of the CIA and supporting the Pinochet regime and all that, and how a lot of that was American backed, and what actually happened. Give that book a read. Africa, Zimbabwe, the $100 trillion note. It was worth €30 when they discontinued it.
they actually issued a $100 trillion note.
Yes, and it was when they finally cancelled the currency, that was worth about €30.
Wow. I mean, I do remember the lira back in the good old day. That was bad enough, but that's crazy.
So, all right. Now, corporations often don't pay tax. Right. These are the
yep. We know that.
This is the corporations that don't pay tax in the US. And this is down to hedge funds. And Australia, roughly 1 in 3 companies, including household names like BHP and Shell, Goldman Sachs, pay no tax in Australia. This is a release from the ATU. The ACTU. And everyone go, yeah, okay. What's actually happening is international tax havens where you'll have like a country internationally, and that's where the head office is, and that's where they'll pay all their tax. But if that is like the Cayman Islands, or actually the largest tax haven in the world is London. And if there was no tax, London. And if there's no tax, then and they can also give secrecy of who's actually on the board of their companies. So you have this thing where no one knows what's going on, and it's all perfectly legal, and tax is just avoided. So tax is for us, but not for the big boys. Is that what it means?
Yeah. I mean, I knew about UK offshore companies, but I didn't know that London was that high up in the.
London's the heart of London is the heart of the financial system. The City of London is a separate country. I didn't know that. Just as is the Vatican. London's it's like the banking sector of London operates to a completely set of different rules and laws. Read this book. It actually goes through all that. We are not going to change anything until tax haven laws are just stopped. So the Panama Papers, I encourage our listeners to research the Panama Papers, which is basically proving this to be true. The Panama Papers refer to 1.5 million leaked encrypted confidential documents where the property of Panama-based law firm Mossack Fonseca, but basically exposing a network of 214,000 tax havens involving people and entities from 200 nations. But they're showing who actually does what. All the large companies, but also a lot of our nation's leaders and everything like that. No one pays any tax except for the citizens in their own countries. So this actually was exposed, and the media, which is bought and paid for by the same people, they didn't really cover it, and the whole thing was forgotten. So, but look it up.
Yeah.
Now, read this book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He was one of these guys that used to go and pressure, as a U.S. government official, nation states into handing over their resources. So he's talking from experience, and it really does show what the system really is. He's put a few interviews up on YouTube. I recommend people go and watch those interviews. This empire is unlike any other in the history of the world and has been built primarily through economic manipulation, through cheating, through fraud, through seducing people into our way of life, and through economic hitmen, and I was very much part of that. So we make this big loan, most of it comes back to the United States, the country is left with the debt plus lots of interest, and they basically become our servants or our slaves. It's an empire, there's no two ways about it. It's a huge empire and it's been extremely successful. Basically, what economic hitmen are trained to do is build up the American empire and create situations as many resources as possible flow into this country and to our corporations and our government.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, but that's how they've been operating.
So take that into modern day with what China's doing.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is everything that we're accusing China of doing, we've done ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, this is the Libor scandal. Also, this is the interbank lending rate that the bankers were basically caught rigging this, and this is actually a bit more esoteric. But what is the Libor rate? But they were caught fixing it, and they were taken to court, and they were basically let off. Research that. But this is to show that there is an inside group who are benefited, who are given preferential treatment. Everyone else is drained. There have been several attempts to audit the US Fed. All have failed so far. This is the last one that was they tried to do, where they tried to, in 2015, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, and so far they've avoided that. Let's look at the books. Now, gold. Here we go. Now, you sent an article out recently where China has been busted for selling counterfeit gold. Right. Well, here is
they use millions of dollars as backing for loans. Yeah.
Yep. The distinct pattern when you look behind the scenes here is criminal behavior is the norm, and no one's immune to it. Right. So this is nation states have been buying gold furiously as this defense against fiat currency meltdown since about 2008, where Russia and China are buying more gold than anyone else. But there's something like 10 times the amount of paper gold in the market compared to the amount of physical gold. The Bank of England is right at the heart of that scandal, where they'll just sell the same bar of gold multiple times. And the gold market has been tainted with a fraud at the scale it's never seen before. Right. So this is another thing I've let's see. Yeah. This was back in 2010, where a gold transaction where the Chinese PRC government was sold a whole lot of gold through the Bank of England, and it came from America, Fort Knox, and that's where it was cast. And they found tungsten in it. All right. So I've got this clip. You can't find it on YouTube anymore, but I've actually got it. I'll play it for you in a moment. Last fall, Rob Kirby of Kirby Analytics of Toronto reported that China's central bank had discovered some 400-ounce gold-plated tungsten bars amongst those it had recently received from bonded warehouses. It was later learned that at least 4 counterfeit bars were found, and all had come from sources in the United States. As suspicions grow about counterfeit bars amongst those held in bonded warehouse for delivery, either COMEX or London Bullion Market Association contracts or shares or exchange-traded funds, investors could panic. Right. So gold bars sold to Chinese central bank in 2009. The Bank of England was the broker, and the bars were cast in the United States. In 2012, the Chinese were busted doing the same thing. So, so I will now play you. Hang on. And I will now go back to sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we've established that it works, let me know when you can see that. Let me know when you can see that.
Yep, it's up. Right.
Okay, now this is was a German on German mainstream TV. It's got English subtitles. It's the only one I could find at the time, and I've since tried looking for it on YouTube, and it's been memory hold. Did you get all that?
Yep, and
right.
Luckily I speak German, so I didn't have to try and read it all the time.
The subtitles are there. It's not very clear, but it's all I've got of the original source. It's been memory hold. This is the problem with digital book burning.
Yes.
Right. So, yeah.
Fahrenheit 451 is going to come to Kindle very soon.
All right. So where were we?
Let me just get that up. Okay. Cool.
Thank you. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm being recorded. I've just had a coffee delivered. So, all right.
It'd be nice to get one of those.
Yeah, my daughter brings them up, and she makes these. It's the equivalent of like an iced coffee with a caramel syrup inlay. Very nice. All right, so you can see that, right? You can see the screen. Right. The next thing was when this happened, Germany said, right. Because this came from the United States, Germany said, we want our gold back. Yeah, the United States have been storing Germany gold in case the Russians invaded. Not all of it, like 40% of it was in the United States, and a big chunk of it was in Paris. Right. Germany asked to audit its gold reserves held by the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury said no. Right. I know it's the Treasury or the U.S. Fed, but whoever was holding the gold, but they said no. And Germany demanded its gold to be returned immediately. And get this, a 7-year delivery schedule was agreed upon. That implies they didn't have the gold, that they'd sold the gold.
I mean, if you have it, you chuck it on a ship or a plane or whatever. Probably a plane.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is just because it's behind closed doors doesn't mean it's still there. Trust us. Right now, they've now completed that schedule. And everything, but that suggests that the gold had to be mined and smelted. If they just didn't. But what's actually going on in there? That is a trust me, yeah. So, and this is what the U.S. Federal Reserve thinks it's going to do. Now, this is pre-COVID. This was their plan. They just planned to. This was the U.S. congressional budget of 2016. It was very simple. They were just going to print more money into oblivion. So they have no plan. So the great unwinding of the financial sector showed that the smartest mathematical minds on the planet, backed by some of the deepest pockets, had not built a sleek engine of permanent prosperity, but a clown car of trades, swaps, and double dares that inevitably fell to bits. Right. So this is where I think we are going, and this is who will lead us there. So here's the net position that we're in. We have an interlocking set of issues. Now, normally when we have a financial systemic meltdown, it's a pretty simple matter. Resettle fiat currencies, restructure all debt, and grow into a new system, shoot all the politicians, and often they'll start a war, a good old-fashioned war to tide things over. This time round, though, we've got an energy supply disrupted. We've got peak energy. And so, oh dear, so we can't sustain growth. Growth is related to energy. And if oil, gas, and coal now are becoming unstable, and renewables are not really in a fit state to step into the breach, we cannot grow the economy. So now, the game becomes change to an alternative energy system at a time when we've got a financial meltdown. So we've got to rebuild all infrastructure to meet the requirements of the new energy system. This is, say, like the alternative, EV system. And that brings us to, well, natural raw materials are unavailable, and, peak minerals. And this is also related to the energy. We can't mine at the same rate if the energy is unavailable. So we cannot supply raw materials for construction or manufacture at the needed rate or volume, if at all. And so I need to assess really what's needed. And of course, we're going to mine our rubbish dumps, among other things. Now, then we bring us to this one here. My model for environmental disruption is not conventional. I'm actually looking at things like the number of species dying off, the oceans becoming acidic, the industrial agriculture failing. That's quite a difficult systemic thing that we're looking at. So what that means is we can't run the existing system for very long. And what I'm talking about here is our industrial agriculture to feed us. That's a thing that's sitting in the background. And underneath that, well, population overshoot. Population is increasing at all levels, and that is putting pressure on all other sectors except finance, which is virtual. And most people have a few relevant skills outside the existing paradigm. So we're looking at willful ignorance and aggressive apathy, because people just say, this is too hard.
Yep.
Right. So are these issues really unknown to senior global decision makers? Are they really unaware? No, of course not.
No way.
And what happens to due process and democracy when there's not around to support everyone? And then put that in context of who really runs our system, the corporate ownership and the banking sector and all that. So how do you think this is going to go? And are they going to be nice about this? We're coming to the end, by the way. So this is at a macro scale, we're seeing a changing of the guard. This is like all the empires over the last couple of centuries, from Venetian, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, France, British Empire, and the United States. How long they went for, like when was the global currency, and when they transferred from one unit to another, it was usually some kind of civil disruption, like the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, or World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, where the torch passed from the British Empire to the United States. I think we're in something like that now. So wealth inequality. Okay, here's some slides. These were made in 2010, but they're just as valid now, because nothing's actually changed, which is interesting. But you've got like this default circle where you go mortgage lenders, mortgage banks, investment banks, all the way out to small countries, Europe, individual states in the United States. The United States will be the last one to default. At the time, the thinking was Europe was weaker and Europe will go first. Now it's anyone's guess who's weaker and who will go first. But you have this thing where you have like things will transfer from the consumer to the corporate to sovereign to fiat currency structure failure. That's the circuit we're going to go through. And the same guy, Gordon Tang, developed this idea of things will move from the financial to the economic to the political. That's the evolution. And he had this basic idea of we're going to start with a financial crisis, then we'll move to an economic crisis, and then a political crisis. And now all of these things are being compressed into the same window. About 10 years ago, it was possible to actually see the difference. So, could we please have a genuine conversation about this? All right. Yeah.
Mate, that is, well, if anyone's watching this and they're like, I don't understand it, I seriously encourage you, rewind. Watch it again. Don't just sit there and say, oh, that's above me. Because
no, it's not. It's everyone can do this. Anyone can do this. The problem is we expect this to be more complicated than it is. And what's actually happened is the situation we find ourselves in is based in fraud. We've been sold an illusion. And when we actually look behind the curtain, our mind is literally repelled by that illusion, because that's our life.
Yeah.
That's
like, oh, that can't be possible. How can that ever be possible? But
yeah.
it is.
Yeah. So guys like the Peak Prosperity guys recommend you find something that whether it's this presentation or the crash course presentation, watch it again and again and again. And a lot of people will go through the 5 stages of human grief with this sort of stuff, and they'll get quite angry and aggro. And it's interesting to sort of watch. It's all someone else's fault. This is the origin. The anger, the underlying cause of anger is being directed. Like in the States at the moment, they're rioting over. It used to be who was going to the bathroom. Remember that? The transgender. Yeah. Right, and before that it was race, and then it was gender, and now we've actually got some riots happening, which seem to be very political, and Orange Man bad. But the problem is, it doesn't matter who's sitting in the White House or in the Kremlin or in Parliament of Australia. None of that matters. The underlying system itself is in deep trouble. And it's decisions made decades ago that have created that, and which means it's not going to be fixed easily.
So it begs the question, what can we do?
Right.
What can anyone do?
There is a couple of layers to this. First of all, I think at the moment we've got a problem. We can't even discuss these problems, because even the average person will take the time to fight you. Remember that scene from The Matrix where Morpheus is walking through the crowd and Neo's trying to follow him and says, these people are so dependent on the system, they'll fight to defend it to the death. Yeah. And they'll think they're doing the right thing. Right. So the first point is, at the moment, we've got to come together in large enough numbers to initiate genuine change and actually understand what we're looking at. So for a start, this information and information like it has got to become public knowledge. That's the first step. At the moment, we are being exhausted with distractions. Like, really, at the moment, it's if they're not shouting, it's all patriarchy. They're ripping up statues, or say, from 200 years ago in the name of racism, while ignoring what we are actually doing now in places like Yemen. That the largest humanitarian crisis ever is unfolding in Yemen, and we are part and parcel to that. On the bad side, we are ignoring that. So it's this level of ignorance that is around us is allowing the situation to continue. So once we get to the point where all parties involved understand, right, and yes, public confidence will crash, and yes, the system will crash. That's inevitable. So when we get through the system crash, what I believe is humanity is going to be herded. An attempt would be to herd humanity in a particular direction to accept crushing austerity measures and food shortages. Right? And if we go along with it, because that's what we've been programmed to do, then we get our police state world. Right? Alternatively, the average person can understand that instead of actually just letting someone else make their own food and do their own thing and depend on someone else to do all their thinking, we're going to have to do a lot of that ourselves. Like 500 years ago, the average person either grew their own food or knew personally the person who did. Yeah, we're probably going to have to go back to something like that while an attempt to maintain our existing levels of education. And I think our technology will probably degrade too if we don't solve the energy problem. So the first thing is understanding for the average person. People like you and me are relatively unusual. We're seen as kooks and crackpots. Leave the establishment, leave our leaders to do the right thing, and stop wasting our time. The rat race. Look at my furrows of worry. Look at my big bank balance. Right.
And all the distraction for an election in a country where it doesn't really matter where who takes office in the end anyway. Yeah,
exactly. But the people on the ground, if they understood that, they'd riot for real. Right. And that's what they're trying to avoid. So once the average person understands the nature of the game and what are the boundary conditions of the future, And so, well, we've got money is becoming unreliable, so it's going to have to, something else is going to have to happen there. Ownership, well, who owns all this stuff anyway? Energy, where's our energy come from, and who owns it? And when they want to start trying military action against other nation states, should we go along with that? Right. So then completely restructure everything. Now, we're at the crossroads. We either go back to an 1800s level of technology where everyone more or less sort of gets by and does their own thing, and the basic unit will become the small town. Yeah, a small town of say 100,000 people, and that becomes the self-sufficient unit. Or we come together and we develop using technology, and there's a lot of things like blockchain and digitization, and there's some amazing technology out there. If we can somehow harness that to solve the problem within the boundaries conditions, then that's our future. But we cannot do that while most of us are asleep and fighting each other. Right. So step one, get to the point where the average person understands this stuff. Without that, nothing happens.
Yeah. So that's really, that's part of why we're bringing this information to everybody. And we hope that you really take on board what Simon's laid out in such detail with such great research. I mean, man, I don't know how you do it, because I get when you lay it out that way, I get it. I wouldn't have had the patience to be able to navigate and put all that together, especially in such a compelling way.
Thank you, but you have to remember, I've had the luxury of looking at this for like 15, 20 years. Yep. Right. So after 15 or 20 years, you can pull things together. When someone's looking at this for the first time, hey, yeah, thank you.
Mate, thank you very much. So everybody who's been tuned into this, please leave comments, whether you're on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, IGTV. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them, and we'll get back to you. And we may even do a Q&A around this one if there's enough people interested in, and please share this, subscribe, and especially to the playlist, but also share this with people because this information, as Simon says, it starts with awareness. Let's get this information out to people. You can do your own research. The books are there, and other resources. Go and find the information yourself and form your own opinion. Mate, thank you so much for being on again. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you for the immense effort of putting all that together once again. Really grateful. And I hope you'll come back on again sometime soon.
Certainly will.
Awesome. Well, mate, enjoy the rest of your day in Finland. And next time your daughter brings a coffee, and please tell her I'd like one too.
She's great. And she usually waits around and says, give me a rating out of 10. And she's normally running around 9.8 and 9.9. But she managed to time it when I'm having a difficult time. Maybe she can hear the swearing or something, but she'll often bring one in at the time. It's great. All right, I'll let her know.
Yeah, do that, mate. Thanks so much. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon on MainUNStream. Have a great evening. Bye.